My first contact with the Red Cross was way back when I was in school. And in my school days, I was not a member of the Red Cross, but some of my classmates were. And one of them was this guy by the name of Jeffrey Chan. Jeffrey and I have been classmates since secondary school, and Jeffrey was a very active member of the Red Cross. After I left school, not only did I lose contact with Jeffrey, but also with the Red Cross. Well, but after that, some years later, I became a doctor. And years after that, in 1983, while working at the Singapore General Hospital, I was amongst the first few in the country to be trained as an instructor in CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Since CPR training in Singapore began at the Singapore General Hospital, and that was in 1983, the people we trained in those days were healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers who worked initially at the SGH, and then we opened it up to other hospitals. But we were just restricting ourselves to healthcare and not to anyone else. I continue to help out the Red Cross whenever I can. I chair the advisory committee of the Red Cross Academy. We are still very keen on ensuring that the Red Cross is able to provide good quality of CPR training. Sometime in late 1984, early 1985, realizing that the real benefit of CPR would be with the public, that if we could introduce Red Cross and bring it into the public domain, then members of the public who would require CPR would have easier access to that skill. We approached the Red Cross and we approached the person who was providing us with the mannequins, that is the manager of Ladell Medical Singapore at that time, a lady by the name of Miss Lim Soo Kin. And she put us together with some of the ambulance officers who worked with the Singapore Civil Defence Force. We sat down, we talked about it, and we said that the Red Cross would be a very good place to start. Why? Because it is known to be a provider of assistance of first aid. Therefore, Ms. Lim Miao Hui, who was then the Chief Ambulance Officer in the then Singapore Fire Brigade, because the SCDF was not yet formed, she got in touch with the Singapore Red Cross and she spoke to the Voluntary AIDS Detachment, or VAD as we called it then. The person who chaired the Singapore VAD committee was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Wan, but he was welcome to the idea of working with us to look into starting CPR training. Now remember, until then, we had only been conducting CPR training in the hospital, especially only at the Singapore General Hospital, because no other hospital was doing it then. So we agreed to begin a CPR training, but for members of the public, beginning with the Singapore Red Cross. And the Red Cross, being a public organization, we thought would be able to deliver this if the Red Cross already had trained instructors in first aid. So what we did was worked out a program, drew up a manual for teaching of CPR to members of the public. Now, when we teach the skill, while in the past we were teaching in a hospital setting to healthcare workers, the language, the terminology that we used was slightly different. When we brought it to the public, we had to teach the same skill, but changed the language so that we made ourselves understood. When we came out with a manual, in those days we didn't have laptops. The computers were just coming onto the scene. We used typewriters. We cyclostyled copies. We didn't have printers as we now have. So we produced a manual. We set up a meeting with Mr. Wan and with some of his officers in the Voluntary AIDS Detachment. They were very keen on this. they agreed. And I was then invited to attend a meeting of the Council of the Singapore Red Cross to present our proposals to the Red Cross Council. But the Red Cross Council, they were very supportive, they were very enthusiastic about this. Now, we also asked then, where would we conduct this training? And they offered this location. And I think there was also one other location just one floor above. It was an open area. It was used by training by the Red Cross Youth and the Voluntary AIDS Detachment when they conducted first aid training. So we said, yes, we'll do it. However, the Red Cross had no equipment to conduct CPR training. They had no mannequins. And therefore, since we were with the vendor for the mannequins that were being used in Singapore at the Singapore General Hospital, Ladle Medical provided the mannequins. The Red Cross agreed to purchase a small number of mannequins. And with that, once we agreed on a date, we launched the Red Cross CPR program. In the very first course that we conducted, it was for between 25 to 30 members of the Red Cross, and they were mainly members of the VAD. So we decided that it was time to bring CPR training into the Red Cross and therefore into the public domain. And we introduced one-person CPR, two-person CPR, removal of foreign objects that were obstructing the airway for conscious patients, unconscious patients, and we also introduced infant CPR. So we had all these modules that we organized. We printed a manual that was meant for layperson training. We organized a full day's program, an 8-hour program that would have covered both adult CPR and infant CPR and airway choking. And we started the program in the Red Cross at level 3, which was just one floor above where we are now. The first group of people we trained, we trained them as providers. And I remember some of those people. We had Stephen Tan, who was then an active VAD officer. We had Mr. Cho Pak Hong. We had Mr. Lawrence Ng. We had Henry Kwan and many of the young volunteers of those days. And they were a fantastic group because they were very enthusiastic. These were all first aid instructors who were conducting first aid training in the Red Cross. We taught them and we were very strict with them. But I meant myself with some instructors. The instructors included the manager of Ladle Medical at that time, Ms. Lim Soo Kin, and some of the officers of the Fire Brigade's Emergency Ambulance Service. Now, these officers were nurses who had been seconded from Ministry of Health to the Emergency Ambulance Service of the Fire Brigade. Remember, there was no SCDF ambulance service yet at that point of time. And they were a very good group. They were very dedicated. We burnt all our Saturdays. All our Saturdays were spent here at Red Cross House teaching CPR training, and sometimes we did it on Sundays too. So we got the mannequins that were purchased by the Red Cross. And after we conducted the first provider training program, we said, well, the next weekend we'll do instructor training. And all those guys who we trained initially, they turned up and we trained them as instructors. And after that, we began to conduct training for other members of the Red Cross. And when we did that training, we did not just come with us original instructors, but we brought the guys we had trained in the Red Cross from the VAD, Stephen Tan, Cho Pak Hong, Lawrence Ng. These people, we brought them in and we held their hands while they instructed. And some of them became excellent instructors, very good instructors. All right, and I thought some of the best instructors I've seen, because being an instructor in Red Cross is not a simple thing like, okay, you just count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. No. So you have to pay very close attention to how the student was performing CPR. You see whether his movements were correct, his rhythm was correct, and they were good, excellent. So much so that one of them, Mr. Stephen Tan, was even invited by the Singapore Medical Association to be their instructor. And you know, the Singapore Medical Association, which is an association of doctors want to be trained by doctors. So when the doctors invited a lay person to instruct them, that speaks volumes for the quality of instructors we produced. So we introduced CPR training to the VAD and to RCY, that's Red Cross Youth. Red Cross Youth was also very enthusiastic, but instead of doing it at one setting, because RCY was then mainly for school children, they broke it up into smaller modules, so they taught it over a longer time period, which was fine because there was no rule that CPR had to be taught at a single setting the way we did it for adults. Over time, we felt that we were always doing it in an open area. It wasn't the best way of conducting CPR training. Plus, a few other things began to happen. Because of the frequency at which we conducted CPR training, I was asked to form a permanent group, so we started a CPR committee. I think the very next year that we introduced training here at the Red Cross, and that was in 1986. And I was also invited then to join the Red Cross as a volunteer, which I did, and I was invited to be a member of the Red Cross Council, which I did. Soon after that, I was asked to chair the Medical Commission, and we looked into training. Training was one of the issues that we were very concerned about. Why? Because the Red Cross was conducting first aid training, but what was the quality of the training? Did we have the facilities for training? Did we do it in an organized manner? The Red Cross training for first aid was then done over a 20 to 24-hour period. Individual instructors would train other members of the Red Cross the way they thought most appropriate. What we did was we reorganized the first aid program. We made it a formal 24-hour program. We organized it over 8 modules, from module 1 to module 8. So each module lasted 3 hours. So usual CPR training was usual first aid training, standard first aid training became an 8-module program conducted by the Red Cross. And the Red Cross was the very first organization to conduct standard first aid in modular fashion. But we also felt that the environment that was upstairs, just a plain open area, was not optimal for first aid training or even CPR training. Why? Because when you conduct first aid or CPR training in an open area, there was a lot of background noise. What one group, which can be very enthusiastic, would be making a lot of noise, and that will affect the quality of the instruction of the nearby group. So we felt that we needed to construct a proper training facility for the Red Cross. So we converted the 3rd level of this building into the first organized, purpose-built life support training center in this country. And that was the Red Cross Training Center. And I think that was done in 1992, if I'm not wrong. And so after that, each time we conducted training, we'd do the initial lectures in a lecture room that we set up upstairs. And after that, the group would break up into their smaller groups. And each group would be in one of those cubicles, what we called training cubicles, so that there was more privacy, there was less noise transmission, and that allowed for much more efficient, better organized training for both first aid and CPR to anyone, whether it was Red Cross members or members of the public. And by then we had already begun training other members of the public, non-Red Cross members. We had opened up the programs to whoever else wanted to learn first aid or CPR. We also were used to ask ourselves whether when we conducted CPR training or first aid training, should we not also give something to those who were, trained in CPR or first aid. And one of the things we considered was giving a first aid kit to someone who was first aid trained. And that would be a good inducement to them to take it back home. They will remember that this is what I got when I trained in first aid. Plus, if anything happens in the home, in the vicinity of where I live, I've got a first aid kit with me. And I could use the skills I've learned to help someone. So we considered all these things. After we had started the training center, we asked the Red Cross to become a member of the National Resuscitation Council. And by being that, the Red Cross programs could be accredited by the National Resus Council, which meant that was like a mark of quality. And so the Red Cross agreed, and the Red Cross became a member of the National Resus Council. The Red Cross trained many people, and the numbers grew, and at times I would see the training center being packed with people, members of the public, Red Cross members, who were learning either first aid or CPR. So that was very exciting. At the same time, I was working at the Singapore General Hospital, where I still work to this day. We said, well, before we go further, let's first see who else taught first aid in the country, because there was no proper documentation of who was doing first aid training, how many were being trained in first aid. So in my department, I was then head of the emergency department at SGH. And so we sent out questionnaires to any organization we knew who were doing first aid training to ask them how many were they training, what was the kind of program they conducted. And we found that there was a lot of variety or variance rather in the way first aid training was conducted. Even in a small country like Singapore, there was no standardization. And we thought that's a shame, that really we should standardize first aid training. We should be reaching out to the public. The country should set priorities for who should be trained. Ideally, every home should have a trained first aider. With the results of that survey that we did, we drew up a package, a proposal, which we sent to the Ministry of Health. The ministry reacted very positively, and the strongest supporter of our proposal was the then Senior Parliamentary Secretary to Ministry of Health, Mr. Chan Su Sen. We met with him because he invited us over there, and he says, yes, this is a very good idea. So we discussed, so how do we begin this? And Ministry of Health was prepared to seed fund this program. The proposal was that we set up a National First Aid Council. Prior to that, in 1998, we had set up a National Resuscitation Council in Singapore. And the objective of the Resuscitation Council was to promote cardiac life support training, namely CPR, which was basic life support training. Also, in 1989, we had introduced AED training into Singapore, meaning training people to defibrillate with automated external defibrillators. And so we combined all the skills under the National Resuscitation Council, which we set up in 1998 with the Ministry of Health. But general first aid, which is more for accidents, for injuries, for trauma, was not included in CPR or AED training. And we thought that it would be good initially if we had a separate council. So we proposed a National First Aid Council. Mr. Chan Su Sen liked the idea, and so one day we thought we should also find out who else could we include, and we thought of Singapore Red Cross, we thought of the St. John Ambulance, and we thought of the Boy Scouts Association and the Armed Forces, because we knew that first aid was being conducted by all these organizations. We first approached the Red Cross, so we contacted General Winston Chu, who was then the chairman of Singapore Red Cross. I'd known General Chu way back during my national service days, so it wasn't difficult getting in touch with him. He asked us to come over for a meeting. So Susan and I drove here. We sat with him and we discussed about the formation of the First Aid Council. General Chu was very supportive, and he had with him another person, Mr. Lim Tiampo. I have known Tiampo since the 1970s because he and I were in the same unit in the armed forces when I was a national serviceman. And so we agreed that we will include Red Cross. General Chu requested that the Secretariat for the Red Cross be housed at Singapore Red Cross and that they will appoint the chairman of the council. We agreed to that, and we were very glad that there was an organization willing to host the Secretariat and administer the Secretariat, because that would spare the Ministry of Health from quite a lot of bother about running the Secretariat. The ministry was a regulator rather than a service provider. So we agreed to all that, and Ministry of Health provided seed funding in terms of a few $100,000 to the Secretariat to run this First Aid Council. One of the very first programs that the National First Aid Council initiated was coming out with a first aid program for the community. The standard first aid programs that were being taught in Singapore were 20 or 24-hour programs, which meant if we did it over a full-time period, it would be 3 full days, 8 hours per day. And we did not expect many members of the public to happily agree to come forward, spend 3 full days at the Red Cross or at any other facility for the matter, just to learn first aid. We had to make it simple for them and just provide them with the most basic core skills to save life or minimize further injury. So we came out with a 5-hour program that combined the essentials of standard first aid with CPR, with the essentials of CPR. And this we called the Community First Aid Program. And the National First Aid Council launched this program in its early days. We came out with the teaching materials. The Red Cross also got lots of small first aid kits which they would give out to anyone who would attend these programs. So we trained instructors for these programs. And it was great because we had finally come up with a program that was half a day long, easier to entice members of the public. It was a very hands-on program. We didn't have any long lectures or anything like that. But really they would come in here and on the spot we'd teach them what to do. We'd explain the basics behind why a particular skill was done as we were teaching it. So that was the beginnings of the first half-a-day community first aid program in Singapore. Some years ago, about I think 5-6 years ago, when the National Resuscitation Council was conducting its annual National Life Saving Day, which used to be on the third Sunday of January every year, we felt that we should combine both CPR and first aid and increase the reach to the public. So we conceived the idea of having the theme for National Life Saving Day to be Community First Aid, and we called it Citizen First Aid. And since we had started that with the National First Aid Council some years earlier, we asked National First Aid Council and the Red Cross whether would they be keen in partnering the National Resuscitation Council in having this program, what we call Community First Responder Program, all right, and get first aid to every household. We had many years ago, when we started the National First Aid Council, identified that a target for the council would be to have one trained first aider in every household by the year 2020. Now 2020 is just around the corner, some months away. And we hadn't achieved that target yet some years ago. We were far from it. So we decided that we could try that with not only with CPR training, but also with having a community outreach program. So in the year 2015 or 2016, I believe, the theme for that year was Citizens First Aid, a community first responder program. So we invited Mr. Teo Chi Hien, and that year National Life-Saving Day was organized jointly by National Resuscitation Council and National First Aid Council. And of course, when we meant National First Aid Council, the Red Cross was the major partner in this effort. We organized it at Pasir Ris in Mr. Teo Chi Hien's constituency. He was our guest of honor, and he launched the Community First Responder Program. And the Red Cross announced then that they would be conducting regular programs in community first aid. And to this day, this program is being conducted by the Red Cross. I think it's a great program. Red Cross Academy is very happy each time we want people to learn that particular program that they conducted. They still give out first aid kits to all those they train in this particular program. And through a combination of Red Cross and other organizations who conducted CPR training and first aid training on a regular basis, we have been reaching out to large numbers of the population. Way back when we started the National Resuscitation Council in 1998, we were only training about 15, 20 or at the very most 24,000 people per annum in CPR. But because of the efforts of Red Cross in reaching out to the community and also making other organizations aware of the need for CPR and first aid training, in the year 2017, in that one single year in Singapore, all the training organizations together trained 180,000 people in CPR. And to me, that's a tremendous achievement, that in a single year we could train 180,000. As a country, we have a population of 5 million plus. And if we want to have one trained person per household, but in 2017, when we hit 180,000 for one single year, suddenly having made that jump from 24,000 to 180,000, we were so much nearer the 500,000 mark. So it is possible. And no country in the world has a trained householder, a trained first aider in every household. And I believe if any country can do it, Singapore, all right, we can do it. And why? It's because of organizations like the Red Cross, like the National First Aid Council, that have seen fit to actually go into that training, reach out, train as many people as possible. In 1999, when we organized the then largest ever mass CPR ever done in Singapore, one of the most enthusiastic groups that joined us was Singapore Red Cross. And all the mannequins that they had available were made available for this mass CPR training, which was done at three community halls in Singapore, one at Clementi, one at Hougang, and the third one was at, I think, Clementi, Hougang, and Tampines, at 3 sports halls. So we had a very enthusiastic supporter, Red Cross. All the instructors we trained all joined in. They came in their Red Cross uniforms, and it was fantastic to see at each of these sports halls people wearing the Red Cross uniform and teaching others, teaching members of the public how to do CPR. And I thought that was a very positive sign that the Red Cross was being actively involved in public CPR training. And this time they were doing it not in Red Cross House, but they were doing it out there in the community in all the sports halls. And to me that was very gratifying, having been involved in bringing CPR training into the Red Cross and now seeing members of the Red Cross in uniform training others, I said, yes, we have gone a long way. And I think Red Cross is an organization that can really spread the message of self-help in Singapore. And I think it'll be a critical organization that will help us achieve our target of getting trained first aider into every household in the country.